Everybody can see my screen. We're going to have some PowerPoint here, and I think really it's good to see some very familiar faces, both in committee work and just personal work. And so it's nice to be with some friends. And so please, I will do my best to pay attention to the chat. So if there's questions that come up, no need to wait. Throw it in the chat, and I'll see if I can clarify where we're at. So my goal by the end of this is that I would really like this group to understand really how the fire service is becoming aware of batteries and how they're responding to them. And bringing the fire service up to speed in batteries is a big issue because it's codes and standards, it's response elements, and it's a big group to try to get in front of to make sure that they have the training and they understand. I think many of us understand all the work that's put into a modern day energy storage system. What happens with everything else, and what is all those things that really start to affect how the service responds and how we educate them? Because we think energy storage in its end capacity. And so we think about it in the wall in that garage, maybe here in Michigan, in the basement, that non-habitable space. We've debated on where you can put energy storage systems and how they should be permitted and where they should be installed. Well, for those of you who reside in California, your view of energy storage is a much more mature view than a lot of the Midwest. I still get phone calls probably every day, maybe not every day, every other day, from firefighters and building officials saying, "Hey, I got my first energy storage system going into a home." And some of you might be like, "That's crazy that we're still having communities having their first." But the fire service has to deal with all the products no matter where they sit or how they sit. So this was one of our incidents, a fire in which started in an occupancy in a company that installs energy storage and photovoltaic systems. See, I don't have to tell this group what photovoltaic is, which is really exciting because usually I have to express that in some way, shape, or form. And so we have this fire that starts in something else and now is consuming. I think many of you are going to realize that those are energy storage products awaiting to be installed. Now, we understand that it's a low state of charge. We understand that how it's going to burn, pretty robust product. But how does the fire service handle these? Because there was significant fire damage. You can see up in the upper units where the forklift isn't, that there was some consumed by fire. We have some down here a little bit lower on the second tier with some damage, and I guarantee you they are all soaked with water. So does that create an issue that the fire service has to worry about, not just with the extinguishment, but with what's next? Now, many of you have seen this picture because I get these all the time from the fire service saying, "What are we supposed to do?" And I need to pause for 1 second. So outside the fire service, I do a lot of consulting work, have for a long time. Bob Davidson and I work together with a group called Code Concepts Group. And so that's my exposure in trying to help communities navigate. So not all of this is in Brighton, it's in places that maybe we've had exposure to. And so here we have EV packs that are going through something, and we have warehouse after warehouse here around Big Three land where the fire service may have to interact. And we think, well, what's the interaction here? And so there's a lot that are in play. We can say we have codes and standards issues, but there's a pivotal part of all things batteries, which is emergency response planning. And I think the tank fire here recently in Garden Grove really played out nationally in a sense of emergency response planning is part of a lot of occupancies, and it's not limited to batteries, although its use is getting quite expanded because of energy storage and batteries. But here we have this, and so we have to understand, how does a fire department put this out? How do they protect this building? What would codes and standards say? And so how do we start to affect this should provide perspective. And so we can see here, we can then add and layer in education. What's the role of the fire service relative to education? And so this is a vehicle that was submerged due to a hurricane with salt water. Now, look at the garage. Look at the things that are in here that could have started fire. And it's my understanding that this vehicle was plugged back in and was actively charging, which I think all of us know you shouldn't do. But we have a culture that has to be changed with our users, with the public. And so the fire service has always been very, very proactive in education, but usually we're talking smoke alarms and we're talking exits and close your doors when you sleep. But now we are layering in how we're going to deal with something like this in a post-disaster situation. And so, um, but then we have these other occupancies. We have this mass collection effort that is really occurring across, I think, most of the globe of how do we handle all of these devices that are battery based, rechargeable devices. If we ask the public and we say, "Hey, don't throw out lithium-ion batteries," most of them are going to go, "I don't have lithium-ion batteries." But if we say, "Hey, don't throw out your Dyson vacuum that doesn't work anymore that's rechargeable," that means something to people. Think about all of us fly. I think I look at you and we've got some million milers here on this phone call, and we should be able to say, "Hey, look, airlines, let's rephrase. Yes, no lithium ion batteries down below, but no rechargeable devices is really something that means aha." And this is a facility in which we had a collection of batteries in various states and various chemistries, not all lithium ion. But the point here is this is the off gassing from one 55-gallon drum of batteries that hadn't moved in 3 weeks, but created an incident response. So, how do we create something that can prepare firefighters for this spectrum? Because one thing I can tell you is how we perceive batteries is all different. Because for some of you, you're thinking stored energy products because that's where you live, that's where you make your money, that's how you work. Others are thinking, well, maybe I'm in the shipping industry, the lower left. I think we know about the incident in San Bernardino there, but between Vegas and California, where we have a tipped over energy storage. And when the driver first approached the fire department when they got on scene, he said, "Hey, I got a Connex container filled with batteries." Well, it is, but all of us know that that looks a little different. And so maybe it's Phoenix who had the Waymo fire. Maybe it's something in transit, the bottom right picture our cells in transit that just weren't packaged right. Let's just think about how we transport DDR batteries has drastically changed here within the last 12 months, and sure, in the last 3 years has drastically changed. But we just had an incident this weekend, of a semi carrying batteries that caught on fire in transit. And so the fire service deals with them in many different ways that they may or may not know. And so we have to prepare them. For instance, the upper right, that's a facility here in Michigan that does some work on a battery pack. And there was obviously an issue, but that's not this big scary fire, right? This is that fire that pack is showing. The pack is doing part of what its job, and the safety standards in an EV pack are drastically different than a mobility device, which are certainly do not have the safeguards our stored energy products do. And so the fire service has to deal with this. Upper left is cells waiting to be utilized that unfortunately, in a movement, humans driving forklifts appear to cause us some significant issues. I don't care what they're moving. Puncturing a set of battery packs or cells, and even at a low state, can cause an issue that needs intervention. And so, if you really look at this, these are pouch cells that had an issue, and you can see the puncture in the lower left corner. It's not a crazy fire, but how do we create what I would call the slide deck for our responding firefighters so that they can make the right decisions for the community, for their firefighters? And a couple of things I love where you see these firefighters, note they're wearing full PPE with face piece. That means they have about 20 minutes of work time when they have their face piece on, that we can take them from a cold zone into a hot zone for them to do work. And then we would need to replace them. That's partly what becomes difficulty. So when we start to talk about how do we prepare firefighters for residential and commercial BESS, the real question is how do we just prepare them in general for all things battery? Because it's an emerging field that, depending on where you're at, it's going to change. So I get a lot of phone calls. And here in Michigan, I think we had five portable battery pack style fires this weekend in which homes or buildings caught on fire that resulted in a response. And so the question in this very small mobility space happens, what does the fire department do, and how do we create a process that's repeatable from small battery packs to EVs to stored energy? And so how do we get them prepared, because their responses are somewhat different? And so it's very easy, and we're not going 90 minutes. I apologize, I didn't catch that. But what really are we doing in how we protect our folks for response by occupancy? There's a changing paradigm that we have to do. More and more of our mobility devices that people depend on, wheelchairs, scooters, those style, are becoming lithium powered at decent sized battery packages. How do we prepare the built environment for those? How do we prepare the built environment for somebody who rides an e-mobility device? You all were talking before we started here about the changes in stored energy for multifamily. And so that's a big question. And so there's no doubt that our fire service is being looked at from the community to lead them. The AI rush is full on in some of our communities. Large commercial energy storage is at a full-time high. And the fire service in the communities are being asked by the public to answer a lot of questions that may be founded on truths, and they may be founded on something that doesn't compare. I think most of us, if you've sat in a stored energy project planning commission meeting in the last year, somebody said Moss Landing, somebody has shown that the whole world's going to blow up, or this contamination, we need to evacuate. Well, how do we equip fire service to be able to be the leaders in their community? So what we teach fire chiefs at times can be different than what we teach the firefighters. And so we have to make sure we bring all of these together, because the last layer that is really expanding here is what is happening in post mitigation best practices. And so whether it's an EV, whether it's a mobility device, or it's stored energy, what are we doing? But then what are we doing when it is a disaster? And so we have these different occupancies that we really have to teach the fire service with, and there's different things that we have to come with. So for instance, if I look at mobility, most of you are going to understand that we have different chemistry than what is found in today's state-of-the-art battery energy storage systems that are listed. We have devices that many times are not maintained. They are subject to weird or odd environments: rain, water, slush, snow. And there's a lot of different things that we may or may not have to do in that space. And so one of the things that when we teach fire service with mobility is the first priority on all incident responses will always be rescue and making sure any potential victims are out of a home, apartment, and building. That's a tough thing to do sometimes depending on fire conditions, but there's plenty of videos where we have these issues that are occurring in our residential space that create obstructions to egress. So if you depend on an e-bike for your success in your career, and your apartment building doesn't provide a safe charging space, where are you going to put it? And typically those mobility device fires many times are done before the fire service gets there. But with this group and most of us, we can talk about that pack design. The chemistry is different than stored energy, and limitations to cell propagation are drastically different. But how the fire service handles this is important, because our fire service is overtaxed. And typically in a home fire, when the fire department leaves and has to come back, we call that a rekindle. Many times it's because there's hidden embers, there's hidden fires, there's pockets of fires that maybe weren't fully extinguished. Well, there's this threat with battery packs that maybe the battery pack and all of its cells haven't gone through thermal runaway. And so we have these agitated, angry cells that, when not processed, could lead to secondary events. Now, that response profile is drastically different than an EV response profile, which is different than how we teach identification of residential ESS. We are seeing as a fire service a lot of early notification through carbon monoxide alarms, not set up because we have batteries, but because every home should have carbon monoxide detection and alarms. And so fire service is going, we're seeing where devices, batteries are having a bad day, there's some off gassing. It's picking it up, and the fire service is able to look at these much earlier. The interesting part that's starting to happen here, though, we have to remember how the fire service currently today operates. If they go into a home and there is light smoke, this happens hundreds, if not thousands of times a day in the United States alone. And so when we think about that sheer volume and what they're doing, it goes something like this. If there's not something on fire, they start looking at electrical outlets. They start looking at things, maybe overloaded plug strips, miscellaneous. But many times it is not uncommon for the fire service to start taking apart HVAC equipment and looking to see if that was the source of the smoke. Well, if I said to many of you, hey, should the fire service start taking apart a listed residential ESS product? All of you are going to say, please don't, because we spent this time to make sure that that and all of the fire stays in there. So how do we teach them to get that early recognition? Because there is no uniformity. Not every house has stored energy. Not every house has permitted stored energy. And maybe it's coming from a car, maybe it's not. And so there's a lot here that we have to do. Likewise, we have to bring that education up on how we respond and what's that stance and what does it mean for when we get into commercial scale. Recently I was in a planning commission meeting for a site getting a 150 megawatt hour site, and we were working with the community, and there was a lot of angst by the public. And they have a major thoroughfare through this major freeway system in two spots through this community. And the day before, I watched some Fluence battery packs running through town. Now, I'm one of those people that are probably going to recognize that. Well, that hazard still exists for that fire department because it's on that freeway. Not because the battery pack's just going to instantaneous, but accidents can happen on that freeway. And so that fire department could have interaction that they will have to deal with. Now, one of the things that we start to say is, okay, well, let's talk about human behavior, because if we just stay in this mobility space for a minute and we're going to build to the stored energy, I want you to watch this video. This is in the city of Toronto. This is everything wrong. This is on the sixth floor. This is a e-bike that the gentleman there made his own homemade charger. And obviously his homemade charger did not work, and it overcharged, undercharged this battery, and we have an issue. Now, let's look at the fire condition changes. And the fire service has always talked and said, hey, fires are fast. But that is a drastic change where if they would have just exited the dwelling unit, closed the door, banged on the adjacent doors, pulled the fire alarm, called 911, we wouldn't have had this issue that is now drastically affecting most of its neighbors. And so how the public or how we start to deal with these is important. And so, the average firefighter in the US goes out a lot of car fires. There are 400 combustion vehicle fires a day in the United States. And that's based on the numbers that we know. And there's maybe one or two EV based on media reports that happen. So how do we change the mindset both from e-bike to EVs, and how do we start to get them to handle these? And so the International Association of Fire Chiefs has really been on the forefront in saying, look, create systematic approaches because EVs aren't the only complicated mobility thing we're dealing with today. Compressed natural gas, propane, hydrogen, and all of the vehicles can have a lot of things. And so we want them to be able to have this slide deck where they identify first. So education is key. And so getting our firefighters just to work with their community and say, hey, look, we want to be able to identify, we want to be able to check. I think it's interesting. FSRI UL just recently released their Amtrak study of some e-bikes, e-scooters in transit, and you could see the effect. And many people might be like, man, we don't have a train like that that's running through a jurisdiction. Well, we do have a lot of other things like buses that could be hauling that equipment as well. And so how do we equip them to handle it? Because to me, it's not just the response, but it's what do we do after? Likewise, I think a lot of you are like, I recognize a lot of things here. So that same muscle memory that I want firefighters to learn to recognize the new Polestar, the Rivian, the Tesla, the GM battery products, the Ford, it doesn't matter. I need the fire service to recognize that. Likewise, I need them to recognize the indicators of other energy inside the home. And let's go away from fires, for instance, at first. The first thing that we want firefighters to be able to do reasonably is control energy at a home. And so for a long time, we have been educating on generators, photovoltaic, and we have been really saying that, look, just because you get a remote shutoff, a disconnect at a breaker, doesn't mean we've controlled the energy. Folks, our fire service can destroy your house looking for hidden fires in minutes. And the last thing we want is some of them to be in these fire environments and have an electrical hazard. And so a lot of training has always gone. And now we're adding this layer from an electrical safety that, hey, homes could have this. But more importantly, how do we teach them if there's off-gassing coming off of that unit? Because I told you that they like to open stuff up. We don't want them opening this up. So what's the process? What's the resources? Tesla has done a great job of tesla.com/first responders, and you can find all of their response stuff there. And many other manufacturers are following suit. I am a big fan to saying, hey, look, please do your, GM.com, bigmikesbatteries.com/first responders. That way we can train first responders how to find these when they need it, because we're going to have firefighters doing what firefighters do here if there's smoke and off-gassing coming off of that product. But we have to educate them because they're action-oriented. We don't want them swinging axes. We don't want them breaching and opening containers. We want to show them what it looks like. One of the things that I wish I could do more of is that more of our fire testing on these products was publicly available. And I get why we don't. But if I could really show the fire here is drastically different than that mobility scooter device, which is different than that EV, I think it would make a profound difference in understanding. And so a lot of our information on stored energy has come from manufacturers, it's come from the industry, and definitely ULFSRI in their consideration for a response. Now, we know that we're always saying, hey, we've got this energy issue we need to collaborate on. And the International Association of Fire Chiefs published a guide that was pretty comprehensive in trying to get fire service to have conversations. One of the best things that I think can happen is when we get firefighters out of the fire stations, they work with their code officials, they work with local installers, and we've got a new photovoltaic, we got a new stored energy, so they can go and look at it before there's an incident. Now, I don't think we can look at every single one, but getting our firefighters to understand what they're looking at and what might be the indicators that these products exist inside of a home. Because once we have an issue, there are some things that we want them to do. We need them in full turnout gear with face piece. We need them to understand that what the smoke is, and we call it gas typically, and what's typically in that product. We need them to deploy hand lines. We need them to heavily ventilate the area. Now, that can be difficult when maybe units are mounted inside of a garage. Midwest, we love our basements that don't always have a lot of ventilation space. So what's the hazard and how do we protect them? And so, how long will this incident last? What will it look like? And so, those are the things that we typically teach firefighters in how to handle this. But one of or part of the difficulty is, okay, well, what what do we do when the incident's done? And so, how do they get on the phone with the manufacturer? How do they get the product? What if there's a fatality or damage to the home? Does it care for fire investigation purposes and chain of custody? Who can they rely on to do after fire event analysis if it's needed? What is safe in the home? And so these are those conversations that our fire service is happening. Now, right, we can say, hey, don't open the box. But when we start to get into commercial and utility from a very general standpoint, our codes and standards, both IFC 1207, Section 1207, NFPA 855, some of the stuff that you all have done, UL 9540, these are our linchpins and our layers of success. And so we have to not only say, hey, look, here's the success level that's happening, but here's the issues at hand that we're starting to deal with as well. And so we have to talk about deflagration. We have to talk about reignition. We've got to have conversations because one of the neat things that I think is different from residential ESS to commercial based is there is a lot of information that could be at what's called an incident commander. So all of our scenes, we will establish command. We will get into something called unified command, where multiple agencies will be working together, including the operator, the OEM, whoever it may be, because we need the situational awareness that exists in those rocks that exist coming out of adjacent BESS units. And when we can start to talk to firefighters and incident commanders and not just say, look, it's defensive, you don't go on the other side of the fence. Maybe. What if the wind's blowing at 22 miles an hour? What if the wind's blowing at 30 miles an hour? What if there's other things happening? So, how do we equip our fire service to say, hey, look, this is a typical response. This is our HMA. This is our specific product. This is a video of our large scale fire tests. So when we say large scale fire, this is what we're expecting. See how the adjacent containers get discolored. Now, Chief, you're going to get worried about that because there's discoloration and what looks like flame impingement or heat impingement on adjacent units. That's where you're going to call this 1-800 number. That's where our ROC is going to be monitoring internal temperatures on the adjacent units. They're going to be able to give you that information. And that's about as state of the art as it gets. Now, we have this BESS record that's confusing at best, but there's a lot of good things that happened. And I don't think I'm allowed to do a stored energy project without talking about surprise, or really it's any of the incidents that occurred before systems were installed per 855, 1207, or 9540 or 1973, right? So we had something that really became the cornerstone of how we want people to respond and what needs to be in our codes and standards. Well, okay, well, we can leave this. I mean, really, Surprise was a building because it was multiple units. It didn't really meet our enclosure size of today, but it's not a building like Otay Mesa that had what, 2-3 weeks of fire crews on standby dealing with significant impacts to the building, which is different than Escondido here, where we have a modern, right? This was what, almost a year and a half ago, 18 months ago. We had what appears, in my opinion, and I think a lot of people, that, hey, boom, we had an incident, we had early notification. It was about 13 hours for it to go through its incident. It was one of the containers. There was some evacuation, which is good. I think we're all trying to figure out what evacuations may or may not need to be. And so, but this, I think, starts to show all the work that people are dealing with. And so, how do we get the situational awareness from something like this to where we want to go. And so that picture to me starts to paint a picture of what's happening and what could be happening. Well, okay, so the fire went 13 hours. What's next? Who do I turn this over if I'm the fire department? What does my emergency management do? Did we get into that discussion with post incident? How long does the fire department have to stay? Do they have to stay there all 13 hours? I showed a picture of us of a fire department taking a battery pack outside of a commercial business. It was an EV battery pack. That battalion chief called me and he says, "Hey, Mike, listen, do we need to sit on this thing?" And I'm like, "Where are you putting it?" He goes, "Mike, I got a parking lot that can hold 1,000 cars. It's sitting in the middle of it, and there's nothing there." I'm like, why can't the business owner hold it for that? And so that's part of some of these tabletop discussions that really need to take place because from time to time, we're battling not only the incident, but the media and the things that are happening. And I think California Flats is a recent incident where there appears to have been some other things that have happened that really weren't container to container, but there was some propagation. But for most of us, this is a pretty remote site. But what I love about this picture is how do we help prepare the fire service who has to make a decision to their community leaders, to the public that entrusts them on what they're supposed to do here from an evacuation standpoint? Because on the surface, that's pretty remote, but there are some things that are around there as well. And so when we talk about all of our code requirements, 855, IFC 1207 do a wonderful job in all the things we're supposed to do, and not only training staff, training fire service. In the most recent edition of 855, we now have continual training or refresher training annually that needs to take place. And this isn't the first time. We have an AT&T, I call it Ma Bell. I think some of you have gray hair, so you understand when I say Ma Bell, what that means. And so for a long time, the fire service has had to go visit these nondescript brick buildings in their city that were switching buildings, and they would have to go in and see all the lead acid batteries as part of Sarah Title III or other things that happen in their community. So conducting annual training are one thing, but how do we take these lessons learned? Because I'll be honest, it is very difficult. I mean, I have a lot of great friends, which we're allowed to get an inside peek, or maybe we've been involved with some of these projects post incident and been able to look underneath the hood and hear what's happened or lessons learned. Because how do we take the lessons learned by the fire service and get it out to this mass? Because folks, some of our fire departments are very rural that are getting some of these large, a site like this, maybe not all the photovoltaic, but 100 enclosures, 150 enclosures, and their fire department is 20 volunteer firefighters. And so how do we get them the training just as much as we give LA City or Denver the same level of training, and how do we make sure they're properly prepared? And so I think we will always be learning from these lessons, but I'm pretty proud of the work I think that the entire business has done in stored energy to create a product that is really performing well. But how do we make sure we're continuing to push that envelope for that safety in what's next? And so I think there's that functional basis. In we heard before I started how UL 9540, 9540A are going through revisions. Joe talked that NFP 855, the 2026 edition, is out. The International Fire Code has had major updates. Its 24 is out. Its 2026 or 2027 edition will be out here at the end. But we have all of these things that we are working very diligent. And what I will just bring to perspective, our average company officer, the person running a fire truck, a ladder company, does not get access to these. And many times in our communities, there's a disconnect between our permitting, our fire prevention, our building official, and the first responders. And so it's really important that we are able to take the bridging of the gap, and push it to the best level we can. Because at 2 o'clock in the morning, we want those firefighters to be successful with all the things. And so we have to be able to say, hey, look, the difference from how you're going to respond to that mobility device, these are very fast moving fires. Where stored energy in the residential setting, stored energy in a commercial setting can seem slow. We can still get false alarms issues. The fire service is used to going to false alarms, just so you know. Um, the amount of false alarms most fire departments go to is probably the second call type they go to. Medicals are probably number one. False alarms from a fire alarm system are probably number two. Now, the amount of fire alarm technology that are going into our enclosures is pretty incredible. And these are some pretty robust fire alarm systems. What do they do when we get a sensor that goes off? The fire alarm company calls and they respond. There's no gas, there's nothing there. What's that process look like? And codes and standards would say, hey, look, when we go to prepare the emergency service, we need to start at that level and we need to go to what we would call a working fire or flames showing outside of an enclosure. And so we have to talk about this layer of safety in not only the enclosures, the boxes, but it starts at the smallest level, which is that cell level. And then we're going to talk about module, unit, and obviously some installation. And as a big proponent of large scale fire testing, there was a reason we put those words, large scale fire testing, in the International Fire Code and NFPA 855 because we wanted to say, prove it. Now, to us, large scale fire testing typically means something, but I think it's helping push the industry in many ways. But one of the things that the fire service is getting really difficult on is understanding the visualization of what that means. And if you've been around some large scale fire tests, there are some that have some pretty incredible fires and pass. And then there are some where you're like, is that a large scale fire? Was there enough cells pushed into thermal runaway? And so we have to be able to talk about that. Now, switching, so we've had this event. Well, what happens when a bunch of EVs get submerged in salt water? What happens when we have flooding issues like we've been seeing across the country where homes are just submerged in water and now they're drying out? What do we do after a residential BESS unit had a thermal event? The adjacent units are discolored. And so we have this thing that we have to make sure that what they do post incident matters. What they do post disaster matters. How we handle it collectively matters. And I'm a big fan of having conversations before the incident. So let's have conversations. The EVs are easiest, right? Let's have a conversation with our towing companies on where they're going to store damaged EVs in yards so we don't get a conflagration if there's a secondary event. Likewise, let's have a conversation of the company. We get a recent install and we want to talk to that company, and they're the company that might come out from the manufacturer to remove it as part of an incident. And so we've seen some very tricky things. Maui was very difficult in how batteries were handled post incident. And so that gave both, I think, Maui and LA have shown that we have this difficulty in what to do in these large scale incidents. And I think that is very much expanding where a lot of training is starting to go into communities and saying, just like you evaluate buildings and property damage for hazardous materials, you really need to be looking for the presence of batteries, both from mobility EV to stored energy. And then you need a process with how we're going to handle it, because putting it as part of the fire debris is going to create further complications that we don't want. So what does it look like in the first 24 hours? What should be the community and that unified command with the manufacturer developer post accident? Or post incident? What should we be talking about? How much monitoring can we expect? What does it look like for the operator when an enclosure had a fire event? How fast are you going to bring up the adjacent units? Will they be decommissioned? Is that part of the plan? So these are, when we say a tabletop exercise, what a fantastic opportunity to go beyond the PowerPoint and say, hey, look, as an industry, here's our experience. We had this fire event in XYZ town. It burned for 12 hours. We're going to start our tabletop here. We're going to talk about what happened next. And so we didn't go inside the enclosure for 3 weeks. We didn't go inside adjacent enclosures for this. These were the things we were monitoring. When we did, these were the safeguards that were in place, and these were the things that we needed to do. Because I think the fire service generally really wants to be able to, in most of our communities, they're the ones that are going to be in these post fire incident issues that have to help deal with it through emergency management. And so, what is it they're looking for? Because when the boss calls, the fire chief, the mayor, whoever, how do they get that appropriate answer of how we're going to handle or what's being handled next? And so, a couple things here, just when we start to look, for the most part, for our daily ops, we're in that cold zone. And cold, warm, and hot zone is something that we've used for a long time in a lot of incidents. And it helps identify where things can go. And so that's where a lot of us will be who don't wear face pieces. The warm zone, we might have some air sampling. One of the most fascinating things that I get asked all the time is, what are we air sampling for? And for any of you who've looked at some 9540A testing, it's interesting where you see certain things fall off at certain feet in the testing. And so in that warm zone, we're going to have a lot of different things happening there. But that hot zone is anything that's really within where there's off gassing, probably within 300 feet, that we would expect a higher level of work. Now, one of the interesting parts that has been happening is some of the work that the EPA is doing, and how I'll give you a recent example. We had a home fire this weekend. We're uncertain what started the fire, but at least 30 battery packs were submerged in water, burnt, melted. And the question is, what do we do with those? So if we're going to overpack them to get them prepared for DOT shipment, that's a lot of 5-gallon, or it's probably a couple 55-gallon containers, and it's several hours of work. So how do we handle that? That was a difficult thing on a very small level. Well, the EPA has been involved with some larger scale cleanups. And I think for those of you who maybe have been paying attention to Otay Mesa, Moss, or have been involved even with an enclosure cleanup, the key is, am I dealing with cells and batteries still? When is a battery no longer a battery? And how do I get that package so it can get to recycling sufficiently enough? Now, what's on the screen is not the standard practice, but I want to show what the EPA has said, because we get this input from the EPA all the time that they're going to be there in many of these events. And so there was this crush in Maui in which they submerged, they crushed, and then they were able to get it to not look like a battery anymore, and they were able to move it. But most of us aren't in this space. So what is the plan? And what would happen typically in the fire service is we would be looking at the owner operator to have that as part of their plan and that decommissioning plan post incident. And so, when we start to look, and we could dive in, and this is probably just a pretty high level. This fire here on the left is a very unique fire for the fire service for many reasons. And on the surface, you might be saying, hey, Mike, that's a Jeep. Well, that's a plug-in hybrid Jeep. But what's very fascinating here is it's next to a Toyota Prius, which is next to a Tesla. And so how is the fire service going to handle that fire? Would take a lot of work, because we have this off gassing. So think of that cold, warm, hot zone. We would have to be transitioning firefighters in 20-minute periods. I'm going to just tell you that this fire is probably going to burn for about 90 minutes. The flames aren't going to go away, but they've got to cool the adjacent units. And so here's a little video. There's a lot of things wrong in this video, but this is a Ford F-150 Lightning. You can see the firefighters up close in full face piece. They're actively cooling adjacent because exposure protection of, I believe that's a BMW, is probably the incident priority. They've made a determination there's no humans trapped in the vehicle. The downward jetting flames there are a good indicator that the battery pack is involved. And you can see that water suppression efforts don't go away. So on a very minute level, it doesn't matter this Jeep, it doesn't matter that Ford F-150. We've got to handle that with the same care so we don't get secondary events. Unlike stationary products that we're probably just going to let sit there for a while, it's a little bit different in how we handle it. So if we go back to residential ESS, we need firefighters to be able to identify early that they're dealing with a residential ESS product that may be on fire. And let's go quite simple. It may not be the ESS on fire. It could have been a combustion vehicle that caught on fire in a garage, and the ESS was an exposure. So we can paint a couple different pictures here, but the key is we need them to size it up. We need them to realize that they've got to disconnect energy, and heavy ventilation with full PPE will always be. And we want them to make sure that they're ensuring there isn't extension into the home. And then really this de-energize and remove. That ain't the fire service. Who's doing that? What's the right way to transport that? Because a couple of incidents I've seen, it just went right in the work truck. Well, I guarantee you there's some people that wouldn't be happy with that. And so how do we document that? So one of the things that we're really pushing hard on, there's a lot of great things, but let's talk disaster, a tornado, flooding, hurricane, wildfire. One of the things that would really help is this robust record set where we have permitting that they can layer stored energy products over the disaster area maps and they can focus on. And really the intent here is there a way to limit secondary fire events? Preloading OEM support lines is a big thing that I talk to the fire service about. How do we get your training, your pre-incident planning, and get it into something that works for the fire department? They all have response software. They all, I mean, I shouldn't say all, a good portion of the fire service has these CAD computers and other things that they're using. And we want to build that documentation habit. And so a couple things that do concern me when we use the word defensive in the fire service, it becomes this thing where sometimes our guard is let down. The last little bit that I just want to make sure our perspectives are aligned. Battery hoarding in DIY ESS is a real thing. You can become YouTube certified. You just need to find the right video and you can watch it. And so when you start to look, every picture I've shown you of a listed product, an EV, for all the work that we've been doing and the things I've been around, that doesn't bother me, but DIY does. This picture here was one I received from a fire chief here in Michigan. He called me 3 times in a row. I didn't recognize his number. I was in a planning commission meeting. I said, well, this must be important. He says, hey, Chief so-and-so said to give you a call. He tell you what to do, but I got these batteries inside of a garage and they're shooting at my firefighters. What do I do? Now, in my head, I'm thinking a listed product. I'm thinking all the things we've worked on, not homemade. And so this person put in their own PV, they put in their own inverters, they put in all their own products, and they ended up with that really became and burnt a good portion of their home down. And so how we handle that is way different. So we have to be able to get our firefighters to understand what they're dealing with. And so I'm going to let this play just while I'm wrapping up. We're going to take questions here in a minute, but this is a EV pack. I won't say who he bought it from, but this is an EV pack. And this gentleman is going to dismantle it and make their own energy storage. It's probably one of the cleanest installs I've ever seen. I will tell you that this is very much real. I was worried about modifying battery packs specifically as it relates to um, mobility devices, but this level of buying a used EV pack, secondary lives for batteries are very much real where people want, and so there's an issue. Jeff, while this is playing, go ahead, ask your question.
Yeah, this is really an interesting topic and kind of leads into that question that, or the comment I've heard stated numerous times that many jurisdictions are kind of branding all battery systems that are made with lithium batteries as if they were e-bikes or hoverboards or kind of homemade systems like this. And the permitting and interconnection for the utility, but not a permitting issue, but the permitting and interconnection has driven a lot of people to homemade systems that aren't being permitted
Mm,
like you're seeing here. So it's a really important discussion. And I would also mention that there are different levels of DIY. I would
mm.
say when I see DIY, most of them scare the heck out of me. And if you want to be horrified and entertained at the same time, go to the DIY Solar Forum on Facebook. And it is a daily, you know, scare fest. So I think this is a really important topic. And I found your presentation very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. And this is probably one of the cleaner ones I've seen. And so, yeah, I just want to leave it there because now, if you think about how do we prepare the fire service, who's typically pretty much understaffed, a lot of busyness with work, and a lot of runs are going up. How do we equip them? And so I hope you got a little bit of a taste that there's about an hour for us to get firefighters mentally wrapped around the response profile to mobility. It's a couple hours when we're dealing with EVs, and it's not just fires, it's extrications, it's how we deal with those. And then when we start to get into the stored energy products, it's drastically different, including how we start to handle or get into this early recognition. And so, yes, our we have this suppression thing that we have to teach the fire service. But I am a firm believer what we do after the fire is out matters. It matters because we don't want those rekindles. We don't want those secondary events. And so, how do we interact? How do we continue to work? And then, who do they call? Right? We as a local fire department might do overpacking for singular residential battery packs that are having a bad day. Who overpacks that warehouse that's filled with 100,000 100,000 square feet batteries waiting to be installed as part of an assembly line if there's an issue there? Who do we call for those? And so there's some things that are there. So Adam, yeah, go ahead, man.
If you could just take a couple seconds regarding decontamination, I found out
Mm,
regarding PPE and AHJs. Well, what about those that the second responders and whatnot, third responders, they might not have any idea of those consequences or what they should do.
yeah, yeah, great question. So for firefighters, you heard me say face piece, SCBAs. That is something that we will do. And any of our firefighters that have proximity indoors with pressure or heat, we will send their turnout gear. We do what's called gross field decon, which is soap and water at the scene. Their gear's packaged, and then we ship it. We use a carbon dioxide cleaning system. A typical residential fire, we have extractors, which are heavy duty extraction. All of our firefighter gear gets cleaned after every incident, and all of our firefighters take showers after car fires, building fires, and that's part of our cancer reduction stuff. When we start talking, I'm so glad you brought this up. I was just having coffee talk with some peers where we were talking about this, where how do we treat civilians that might have proximity to off-gassing batteries? How do we treat secondary responders, and what should we be doing? And I would say that there's no doubt that there are some things that we've got to make sure. Wearing gloves, the right type of PPE, figuring out ways that we're not carrying that to our home, in my opinion, is really important. So if I employ a bunch of secondary responders who maybe are overpacking damaged cells, I would really make sure that they have the right PPE, and I give them a space to at least do some field decon and not put that in their personal vehicle and carry it. I think you're going to start to see more and more of those. So, great question, and probably more to come on that. Sue, yes, I will. I will give staff the copy of the presentation, and they will share it.
Thank you,
Um,
sure.
yeah. Any other questions? Oh, and by the way, this is, if you didn't scan this, we send out a brief email. I don't spam your email, but we try to stay on top of codes and standards, hot topics. I think our next one's going to be about the electric code and energy storage, so that might drive some interesting conversation. If you're at all interested, but mostly battery and updates on codes and standards type stuff. So please join it if you would like. And then questions, and there's my email address. Jeff, go ahead, man.
Yeah, just one quick question. I've heard some talk recently about some statistics for incidents involving energy storage systems. I don't know if you're familiar with any databases that might exist out there, but think that in the long run, we're going to really want to see this data for us to make better codes and standards language. So have you got any resources that you're familiar with that could be helpful?
Yeah, great question. So the International Association of Fire Chiefs is working with FSRI UL on the nearest. So the U.S. Fire Service just recently changed its reporting. Basically, January 1st, everybody had to be on the new system from NFIRS into nearest. And so there are ways for us to start tracking residential and commercial ESS in the fire reporting software. I asked if they could pull something, if we're seeing anything. And like anything else, I think we're seeing a bunch of stuff getting miscoded. So the International Association of Fire Chiefs is going to help put out a guide for reporting efforts from the fire service, from mobility to EV up to stored energy products, because we really want that to be a little bit more timely. I mean, obviously, EPRI does their work of based on media and their reporting, but it's interesting how many times I get phone calls of, we had one of those boxes on fire with batteries in a basement. And so that's where I get a little bit like, and what'd you do? And I'm hearing a lot where the fire service, hey, it stopped and we left, and we left it with the homeowner. And so we got a lot of work to do. And I'm hoping that through data, if we can get the current data quarterly, every 6 months, that we might be able to share a little bit more. But yeah, a lot of everybody's doing public scrubbing events, and it's just not as robust. I mean, because take the EV, everybody's excited about EV fires, and I just look at the number of traditional car fires that happen all the time. And EVs, although new, the rates just don't seem that high. Oh yeah, and somebody put thanks Jeff. He put the Jeff. He put the EPRI stuff.
Yes.
Any
So
other?
this is helpful, and then I guess there might be some additional data that's coming to light. I guess the perception I have is that 9540 certified energy storage systems are, I guess my perception is they're much safer than many other lithium batteries that are commonly found in homes today. And
Yeah. Yep.
including the portable batteries, which is where my biggest concern lies, is that we've got so many inexpensive portable battery systems that are growing rapidly because there is a perception that I don't have to permit it and I have no rules as to where or how I can use it. And obviously there are those of us that have worked very hard in the 9540 realm and in development of energy storage codes that are seeing oftentimes the more, I guess, more stringent requirements than even the code requires, driving people to these uncertified and presumably less safe portable battery systems.
Yeah, and we didn't really talk about it today. And all my presentations for the fire service, right, with those DIYs, I show all of the consumer available stuff that's out there. And in my opinion, the hazard doesn't change. We would require a permit if you put that amount of stored energy. And I would even make an argument of where we're starting to see the electrification of everything. I think a lot of manufacturers are starting to realize that maybe switching currents are allowing them a lot more flexibility. And so I think in the next 3 or 4 years, we're going to see a lot of batteries on things that we would call ESS. It meets the definition of ESS. And I think the tricky part is it's going to be inhabitable spaces. Case in point, the international codes had proposals for, I think, up to 10 kilowatt hours on stoves. And so on the surface, it makes a lot of sense because they're trying to fix this natural gas power issue that can happen. But what happens to our built environment? Because if you came to us with a 10 kilowatt hour ESS and said, hey, I want to put it in my kitchen, we would tell you no. But all of a sudden, I put it on a stove, but it's not right. People don't want to call it ESS. One of the things that I try, ESS sneaks in places, and I'm a big fan. I just want it to be permitted the right way. People are putting a lot of batteries in boxes with good intention for something, and they just don't realize the work like a lot of you do or are involved in, or a lot of our partners are involved in. Just look at charging vehicle infrastructure in remote areas that want to get closer to level 3, and we start slamming batteries in boxes, but nobody wants to call it ESS. And so you are, Jeff, you know this front and center that just we're going to keep seeing this expansion. And that's where I'm going to go back to that education part, that we are trying to help equip the fire service to continue that dialogue, to at least give people the chance on what to do. And it goes from don't throw your rechargeable devices away, because we don't need fire crews tied up on trash fires, which trash fires are through the roof right now. And we don't need homes to have unnecessary incidents because unlisted things are going in. And so it's how do we keep that education? And it's Building Safety Month with International Code Council. I know that I tried to push out some LinkedIn posts and other things to try to, keep that discussion going. But yeah, it's a tough one.
Well, I'm hoping we can get to the point where there is some awareness that a 9540 certified energy storage system is a far safer choice when permitted than a portable battery that you can pick up at Harbor Freight that probably doesn't have any certification at all and is going to be bounced down the road to your favorite camping site through the rain and snow and mud, brought back home and put into your kid's bedroom. So that's the reality of what we're seeing grow rapidly as we speak.
True. Yep. And right, that's where part of our passion keeps coming, trying to equip code officials so they can get those permits out. And yeah.
Well, thanks again. Appreciate the presentation.
Yeah.
Trying to get myself off of mute there. Michael, very good presentation. I think that there's so many gaps, but you are recognizing the gaps and trying to fill those gaps, get that education out to those people that need it, and that's really critical work. And I appreciate that. What a wonderful presentation. Anybody else have any questions? Last call for questions. Again, a lot of people enjoying the presentation. Michael, thank you again so much. Just a wealth of information from you. Really appreciate you taking your time to be here with us. And I hope that you could see from this audience, it's well appreciated.
Yeah. Thanks for everything that everybody here does. And I'll see you at a code meeting in the near future.
You will. Thank you again, Mike.